Can Call of Duty be anti-war? I'm not kidding, this is a genuine question. This thesis sounds deeply absurd, as the franchise is widely known for being the exact opposite end of the spectrum in proper meaningful discussions about war. The Call of Duty franchise, as a collective, is troublesome in representing war in any meaningful way. The series is ingrained in collective memory and popular culture as the equivalent of a typical Michael Bay filmography, or the military action film equivalent in the video game industry. Call of Duty is deeply problematic in its depiction of war, alongside its representation and its relationship with the military entertainment complex. It utilizes protagonist-centered morality to glorify violence, endorse nationalism, failing to criticize propaganda and the psychological effects of war, instead depicting a power fantasy that refuses to challenge player expectations on questioning these themes during wartime. However, that raises a much larger question that has barely been asked. Is it possible for a Call of Duty game to be anti-war? Before this video begins, I must give a disclaimer. This video will only be discussing the single-player campaigns for the Call of Duty games, as these narratives are far more concise and are the main feature point for Call of Duty's narrative ambitions. Although there are potential anti-war messages in the zombies and multiplayer mode, there is so much zombies lore to analyze that it would essentially be another video of its own. Moreover, the seasonal narratives in the multiplayer mode, which started around the release of the Warzone Battle Royale, will not be considered, as there are far too many plotlines, in-game intel, and world building to consider for each individual game, and also, I simply do not care enough to analyze them. The multiplayer in Call of Duty is not created with the intention of communicating a message to its audience, although there are implied anti-war messages with the nuke kill streak and the Nuketown map, which can be considered as harboring a unique anti-war message in the multiplayer. The main discussion for this video will be the franchise's single-player campaigns. I will not be discussing the multiplayer for this video, I am not doing it. To understand what makes art anti-war, we need to understand the origins of warfare and where the anti-war movement began. War has existed for as long as human civilization has persisted. Battles and conflicts between different groups, clans, cities, and civilizations have occurred since the beginning of recorded human history.
Hey, so post-production Anthropic here, you're probably thinking, oh god, why is this guy going back to like the start of the origins of warfare? But please, I assure you that this is all like relevant to the topic. Everything that I'm going to be saying here in the next 15 minutes is deeply important for the essay, so yeah, please stick through the research, it's really important.
However, war, despite it being an ongoing phenomenon as evident by the recent invasion of Ukraine by Russia, is not a part of human nature. War is driven by various complex factors that are not linked to the biological or evolutionary state of humans. Brian Ferguson argues that there is no definitive answer for the origins of warfare. The earliest recorded conflict occurred either during the last ice age, around 9700 BC, during the Mesolithic period in Central Europe, or at the Jebel Shahaba site near the Nile in northern Sudan, occurring at around 12,000 BC. Brian Ferguson deliberates that the conditions that make warfare more likely to occur during these periods include a variety of factors, such as a growing regional population, a concentration of valuable resources such as livestock, increasing social complexity and hierarchy, trade in high-value goods, and the establishment of group boundaries and collective identities. Such factors are not determined by human evolution and are instead perpetuated by social, economic, cultural, environmental, and ideological factors that Ferguson describes as, when people have more to fight over, their societies start to organize themselves in a manner that makes them more prepared to go ahead and embrace war. While archaeology can demonstrate when such wars have occurred, ethnography, the study of different cultures, illustrates that the preconditions of war are based on social factors as demonstrated by simple and complex hunter-gatherer communities. Simple hunter-gathering societies have occurred for much of humanity's existence for over 200,000 years, where groups have cooperated with each other and lived in small, mobile, and egalitarian groups, where conflict was minimal but not impossible, and cooperation between them was encouraged. In contrast, complex hunter-gatherer societies lived in fixed settlements with hundreds of populations. Social rankings were apparent in individuals, groups, and resources were restricted by political leadership. Social complexity, as a result, led to these groups engaging in warfare. However, these preconditions did not occur in every society, such as those in the southern Levant. These preconditions for war existed for thousands of years, with little archaeological evidence of warfare occurring in that region. While war has existed for millennia, it is not due to evolutionary or biological explanations for why human societies go to war. Therefore, from archaeological and ethnographic research, it can be determined that warfare is not an evolutionary part of human nature, but a complex web of social, economic, environmental, and political causes that encourage member states to engage in conflict. This idea of warfare being antithetical to human nature is essential to understanding the anti-war movement. While opposition to war has existed for centuries, with the earliest anti-war movement in the United States being the War of 1812 and the American Civil War, the anti-war movement reached its notoriety during the Vietnam War and the war in Iraq, with opposition to warfare and US intervention continuing into the present day. War leaves an irreversible impression on people who experience it, and the social attitudes of warfare extend to how it is depicted in arts and culture. The earliest depictions of warfare are through cultural artifacts such as art palettes and statues. Art amongst the ancient Egyptians and Roman statues of wounded soldiers demonstrate these cultural depictions of war. Such depictions of warfare illustrate various perspectives, including martial prowess and the glorification of military victory. Yet, ancient depictions of warfare also feature images of terror, misery, and the horrors of ancient war, illustrating that anti-war depictions in art have existed for thousands of years and can occur in all cultural artifacts from ancient relics to statues. One modern example of how modern warfare is depicted through statues is the Shrine of Remembrance. Located in Melbourne, Australia, it was initially created to honour the men and women of Victoria who served in the First World War. It now functions as a memorial to all Australians who served in any conflict. The shrine has a central sanctuary where a marble stone of remembrance is placed with the phrase, "Greater love hath no man," where on Remembrance Day, at 11 AM on the 11th of November, a ray of sunlight shines on the inscription to highlight the word love on the stone. This design is intended to reflect the somber and poignant themes that befell the victims of the First World War. Australian World War I commanders, such as John Monash, argued that the memorial must be used for remembrance and promoting peace, and anything utilitarian, such as city beautification schemes, like a city square or arc, was not a memorial, but instead used to celebrate triumph. This attitude was refuted by conservatives at the time, as the original design was lambasted for a variety of reasons, such as its message, the lack of Christian iconography, or that the funds could have been spent on a memorial hospital instead. Keith Murdoch, yes, the father of that Murdoch, decried the original design and wished to transform it from one of remembrance to glorification, describing the shrine as too severe, stiff, and heavy, that there was no grace or beauty about it, and that it is a tomb of gloom for a war memorial. Other conservatives, such as then Premier of Victoria John Allen from the National Coalition, suggested an arc of victory instead of the somber ideas that defined the shrine's original design. This reactionary backlash against the shrine's message highlights the differing attitudes of portraying war across the political spectrum, even over 100 years ago. The attempt to politicize and subvert the meaning of the shrine has been challenged even today, where far-right Australian nationalist groups have controversially used the shrine for political protest. While ordinary Australians view the memorial as a monument to remembrance, others have used the shrine as a symbol of Australian nationalism to fuel jingoistic rhetoric, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, and more recently during the Anzac Day dawn services.
Australia for the white man.
Shut him out.
Australia for the white man.
Shut him out.
Loser.
Australia for the white man.
These protests invoke ideas such as heroism of the Anzac myth, perpetuating themes of anti-immigration, racism against Indigenous Australians, and far-right nationalism. These protests have been widely condemned by the media and the public for violating the sanctity of the site. This illustrates attempts by these groups to subvert the meaning of cultural monuments dedicated to remembrance and peace, subverting the message of these cultural artifacts and twisting them for political purposes to fuel militarism, chauvinism, and hateful rhetoric. These depictions of warfare have extended to other forms of artistic expression as culture has developed, initially starting with cave paintings, statues, and artifacts, further developing into other modern forms of art such as literature, films, and for this point of discussion, video games. With the development of other media such as film, representations of war have grown from romanticized depictions to negative ones as art and media forms have expanded and evolved over the last few centuries. While a relatively new media format, video games have produced some of the most important anti-war works such as Spec Ops: The Line and This War of Mine, which focus on the psychological effects and civilian perspectives of war, functioning as critiques of the action military shooter genre. One franchise that is at the opposite end of these depictions of war is Call of Duty, a franchise allegedly dedicated to portraying warfare in the most realistic manner possible, including historical conflicts such as World War II and the more recent conflicts such as the War on Terror and allegories for those currently occurring in the Middle East. However, the series examines the effects of warfare with ill-informed intent, demonstrating a lack of understanding of the conflicts it seeks to portray, and instead engages in a power fantasy that fails to provide a clear anti-war message to its audience, whether through ill intentions or its inability to commit to the themes it desperately wants to portray. Call of Duty, as a collective franchise, cannot be anti-war. And the one time it almost was. Before examining the Call of Duty game that challenged the tropes of the franchise, we need to understand what makes art anti-war and how Call of Duty does not adhere to any of these themes. While promoting his then upcoming film, Saving Private Ryan, Steven Spielberg quoted, "All war films, good or bad, is an anti-war movie." Spielberg contends that war is naturally a horrific and evil endeavor. If a war film intends to not be anti-war, Spielberg's philosophy argues that the true nature of warfare, through its brutality and human cost, will ultimately convey an anti-war message to the audience. Spielberg's perspective on anti-war art have drawn both praise and criticism. Some critics have contended that Saving Private Ryan masterfully portrays the horrors of war through its brutal opening sequence of the D-Day landings. Conversely, others contend that the film contextually provides a sense of patriotic heroism that justifies the Second World War as a noble war fought for noble means, arguing that for art to be anti-war, no war can be justified, as it diminishes what anti-war message that could have come across from the film's brutal depiction of the D-Day landings. Given Saving Private Ryan solely focuses on military history rather than character drama such as Band of Brothers, the film does not go into the reasons and causes of why the Second World War was fought, in contrast to Band of Brothers, which examines the impact of the war on the protagonists and the weariness they experience, later discovering the true horrors of why the Second World War was fought. The lack of context to the origins of the Second World War is a key feature of many anti-war World War II films that defined 90s filmmaking, focusing on historical military campaigns and events rather than the civilian experience. This also extends to other media that was deeply inspired by 90s war films, where early Medal of Honor and Call of Duty games perpetuate this philosophy. This, however, reinforces particular issues that World War II media perpetuated during this era, such as the lack of examination into the causes of World War II and its effects on civilians, the impact of aggressive militarism, colonialism, territorial expansion, and the racial theories of the Nazi genocide of European Jews, Slavs, Romani, and many other ethnic groups. These elements are barely discussed in war media because it takes away from the military aspect of the narrative. Early Call of Duty games feature Spielberg's philosophy on war. The series sought to portray the Second World War as realistically as possible, from weapons, locations, and equipment, with further emphasis on your fellow comrades and squad mates during gameplay sequences to create an immersive experience, allowing the player to feel a part of a historical conflict rather than a lone wolf, one-man army in the Medal of Honor games. This philosophy is further reflected in Call of Duty 2, which features documentary-style introduction videos giving historical context to the game's recreations of World War II battle sequences.
Now the year is 1941. With an army over 7 million strong, the Nazi war machine turns to the east and begins the invasion of the Soviet Union.
While these games aren't ideologically or narratively anti-war, they encompass the idea of the player being a part of a squad that feels real and human, which for the 2000s was groundbreaking for the genre, giving the player the impression that they are part of a squad that is witnessing history through the game's commitment to portraying these historical events in a somewhat accurate portrayal, emphasizing immersion similar to its contemporary World War II films that inspired the games. However, these stories lack any meaningful perspective about the war from a civilian perspective, again diminishing the causes and impacts of the war in favor of reliving noteworthy historical battle sequences such as Stalingrad and the D-Day landings. Conversely, the late French filmmaker François Truffaut, quoted during the release of Stanley Kubrick's anti-war film Paths of Glory, famously quoting that there is no such thing as an anti-war film. Truffaut argued that no matter how a film attempts to portray war, they will inevitably glorify combat because films, in his words, make violence ambiguous due to the filmmaking's need for the audience to be enticed with excitement, root for the characters on screen, and be thrilled with visceral action sequences to gain the audience's attention. He does not argue against the intent of anti-war films, but rather the conventions of the filmmaking medium do not allow for the audiences to truly experience the horrors of war, which unintentionally aligns the audience with the visuals and spectacle rather than the thematic prowess of the fertility of warfare in anti-war films. There are multiple interpretations on what makes media anti-war, and there is no definitive criteria. However, there are multiple concepts and themes that prominent anti-war media and literature include in their works. These concepts and themes include a lack of victory and a criticism of heroism, a criticism of propaganda, the psychological toll of war on the soldier, and a criticism of chauvinism. Call of Duty outright rejects any of these criticisms of war. The franchise is deeply rooted in upholding practically all of the tropes that anti-war art seeks to subvert. The series features traditional Hollywood action movie set pieces interlaced with American patriotism, narratives that feature lackluster characterization, stories that blindly indulge in pro-war military propaganda, perpetuating abhorrent morality and ethics, and exemplifying chauvinistic and sometimes outright xenophobic geopolitics. Call of Duty is the exact opposite end of the spectrum of media that seeks to properly analyze the effects of war. The series at large upholds the ideal American power fantasy that defines much of blockbuster Hollywood action films, upholding these concepts rather than criticizing them. Heroism is abundant throughout the Call of Duty series. The series often includes endings and action set pieces which feature moments of glory or feelings of triumph to mesmerize the player into the heroic power fantasy. Scenes that include triumphant music, patriotic symbolism of American flags, and traditional good versus evil plotlines are commonplace in the Call of Duty franchise, such as Black Ops and Modern Warfare.
You're Russian. This plane is full of Russians. How could you kill your own people?
No, I'm not kidding them. You are.
These stories indulge the player into nationalist storytelling that highlights the courage and bravery of the soldier, displaying persistence to accomplish the mission to save the world from calamity. Furthermore, Call of Duty fails to provide any criticism of propaganda that meaningfully challenge the preconceived historical narratives that dominate American society. Even when the franchise does try to challenge such narratives, it always winds back to the traditional good versus evil tropes that define the series. Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War, for example, attempts to challenge the notions of American propaganda by highlighting the atmosphere of Cold War paranoia of the other side threatening the other's way of life.
You've been given an important task, protecting our very way of life from a great evil.
Comrade Belikov, we are in grave danger from the capitalists. Our collective, our very way of life is at risk.
Unfortunately, even when the game gives you the option to take the American or Soviet side, it will always result in the Soviets being portrayed as the big bad antagonist hell-bent on destroying the United States through nuclear Armageddon, preventing any attempt to create nuance on the absurdity of the ideological paranoia that defined the geopolitics of the Cold War period. Moreover, the series does not include any critique on the psychological effects of warfare. While the Black Ops series does feature psychological elements during its interrogation sequences, including mind-bending worlds and distortions of reality, they are frequently used in scenarios where torture is prominent and justified, often used during the climax of a story for a big reveal, such as in Black Ops and Black Ops Cold War. During these sequences, torture and psychological brainwashing is utilized to extract information for the greater good, often ignoring the moral implications of using such actions of state violence. Jacob Geller argues that torture is utilized in the series as a method of normalizing the practice to a wider audience. Particularly, the brutality of torture scenes in the games is made to evoke a sense of punitive justice against the antagonists, rather than getting genuine information out of the subject, given that torture itself is deeply unreliable in gaining intelligence. This enhances the idea that the immoral actions of the antagonists make the practice justifiable as a form of justice against evil, and the morality of the organization and protagonists who perpetuate torture are ignored.
I want the missiles, I want the target, and I want Hassan. And you've got 10 seconds, or I'm going to show you the difference between military and me.
A recent example is in Black Ops 6, where the protagonist's team capture the main villain, Harrow. To extract information out of her, the team injects her with a truth serum that recounts repressed memories to find the location of a chemical weapon the Pantheon have acquired. Harrow highlights reasons for her motivations to destroy Washington, D.C. and take over the CIA, which she believes is
Do you really think an organization as corrupt, as decadent as the CIA should pull the world strings in a new world order? We'll make sure that doesn't happen.
She recounts that Adler and the CIA were responsible for murdering her parents, only for Woods to gaslight her on her own memories.
How do you know someone else didn't kill your parents? It could have been the goddamn Pantheon themselves. You were a kid. Can you really trust your own memories?
It was.
How can you be so sure? Adler. Bullshit. If it's true, that means your parents were double agents. Or worse.
Never!
Woods' comments are not refuted, but endorsed by the narrative, as the story argues it's just her psychological, split, evil side that motivates her.
I'm fading, Frank. You have to stop this. Stop me.
Rather than the actions of the CIA itself, leading to her intent to destroy the organization, even when attempting to criticize the long-documented and confirmed human rights violations by the CIA, Call of Duty cannot shift any blame on the morality to the organization its protagonists belong to. Instead, arguing the actions of the villain are not due to CIA human rights violations, but an external, evil side to Harrow that can be relinquished. Finally, chauvinism is commonplace throughout the franchise. This is the common belief that your country is superior to others. Call of Duty frequently features nationalist themes that reinforce exclusionary and at times xenophobic rhetoric. While well-known examples of chauvinism in the series are Call of Duty Ghosts and Modern Warfare 2, both of which provide ill-informed depictions of South America and the fantasy of foreign invasion of the United States, the least discussed example of chauvinism is in Call of Duty World at War. While World at War is often praised for its dark tone and graphic violence, the game's depiction of the Pacific Theater utilizes violence as an element that is directly linked to the game's nationalist jingoism, reinforcing the superiority of the American soldier compared to the Japanese soldier, and failing to provide a proper criticism of nationalism. Instead, the game indulges in patriotism for entertainment. The American soldier fights with bravery and persistence, and the Japanese fight with dirty tactics that are savage and cruel.
It's all snarled up on something. Shit! Grenade!
There is no dissection in World at War into how the difference in Japanese culture played a role in their brutal tactics, such as the hierarchical society and Bushido culture that encouraged its soldiers to fight to the bitter end. Nor is there an examination into the impact of that violence on chauvinist behavior by the Americans.
How do we explain the high morale, the famously high morale of the Japanese military, where they would refuse to surrender even after given orders by their superiors?
It's true. It's because it's a different culture. So in Japanese culture, you belong to in-groups or out-groups. So the biggest in-group the Japanese belonged to was Japanese people and everybody else. But within Japan, you come from a province, a locality, etc., and you owe loyalty. It's obligations. In the West, it's all about liberties and my rights. In the East, it's about obligations to other people. So the moment you as a soldier start losing a battle, instead of in the West where you can retreat, you can surrender, and it's not dishonorable because you're going to live to fight another day. In Japan, you're a failure. And therefore, if you go and come home back as a failed soldier, you bring dishonor to yourself, your family, your locality, anyone you are associated with. So that's why it is so difficult for them to surrender. However, by the time you get to the end of the war, they are so exhausted. Think about it. And it's a shattering that occurs.
This critique should not be mistaken for excusing Japanese war crimes during the conflict, as Japanese war crimes have endured a continuous and rightful reputation for cruelty. Unlike other war media, such as Letters from Iwo Jima and the Pacific, which examine the effects of Bushido Code in Japanese culture, and the dangers of chauvinism through the violence of Japanese war crimes, with the latter analyzing its effects on American jingoism. For example, the Pacific analyzes directly how militaristic Japanese violence led to Americans harboring anti-Japanese sentiment, exemplifying a culture of violence in the military that in some respects rivaled the brutality of the Japanese. Sledge, one of the main protagonists, has a character arc which represents this criticism of chauvinism.
Just gave away our goddamn position! I think they got a pretty good idea of where we are. I told you to cease fire. Are you supposed to be observing? I see you with the goddamn sidearm. We were all set here to kill Japs, weren't we? So what the hell difference does it make what weapon we use?
The series examines the dangers of nationalism and xenophobia, and analyzes its impact both on the soldier and the civilian population during the Battle of Okinawa. Sledge's hatred of the Japanese lead him to executing random civilians, including bombing a family, which results in him rediscovering his humanity, effectively highlighting the pointlessness of chauvinism and xenophobia during wartime, leading to nothing but suffering for everyone caught in the crossfire of war. In contrast, World at War instead encourages the player to live a violent power fantasy where flamethrowers, rock music, and encouragement to commit acts of violence and outright xenophobia drown the game's background. This violent nihilism refuses to reflect on how these attitudes perpetuated the horrendous suffering that occurred during the Pacific Theater, and instead exemplifies the violent rhetoric that embodied its notorious ferocity. Unlike other games that use violence like The Last of Us Part 2, where the game actively discourages engaging in combat due to limited resources, making the game far more shocking when violence is utilized to stay alive. World at War instead gives the player extremely powerful weapons with plenty of ammo and enemies to kill that are required to progress, making the player feel empowered and emboldened rather than uncomfortable, stressed, or anxious in a true war setting. Instead of critiquing excessive violence during wartime, World at War encourages the player to enact and enjoy the violence they inflict upon in the game. This is done through the game's soundtrack and banter from friendlies. The game's soundtrack features triumphant and heroic music to embolden the player. It does not utilize its eerie menu theme that perfectly captures the horrors of war. Instead, the game emboldens the player through trumpets and electric guitar rock strings. The player is also encouraged by their squad mates in-game, who often proclaim feelings of revenge and at times chauvinistic rhetoric.
We're gonna make them pay for what they've done.
Fuckers! You worthless animals! You like that, you piece of shit? Outstanding!
By failing to provide any introspection into the game's violence and jingoism, the game acts as a form of edgy, mindless entertainment rather than a real depiction of the horrors of war. Through giving the player powerful weapons, a soundtrack that empowers the player, and an encouragement from squad mates to enact violence, World at War utilizes the horrors of war as a form of non-provocative entertainment instead of demanding proper introspection on the dangers of chauvinism, violence, and xenophobia. All of these elements combined make it extremely hard for Call of Duty to make a statement against war, as the franchise is dedicated to upholding all of these principles as the series has progressed. However, one sequence that has gathered much discussion since its release in 2007 is in Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare.
We have a confirmed Everyone hang on!
On one hand, the nuke sequence has been interpreted by many as a metaphor for the contemporary uncertainty of America's attitudes on the war on terror and the nature of American intervention after the 9/11 attacks. The nuke in Call of Duty 4 highlights one of the strongest and most powerful scenes in the franchise. Retrospectively, it offers a perfect metaphor on the nature of American interventionism. There was no heroism, no success that came from the war on terror, just nothing but death. There is no objective in this mission. Your purpose is to watch as you and your comrades die from the nuclear fallout. The remaster improves this sequence by having them initially survive the crash, only to die from radiation sickness as you do shortly after. The haunting cries of children playing in the background, "If you live that long, can be heard in the distance. The nuke sequence is a haunting and horrifying depiction of mankind's worst fear of nuclear holocaust. Consequently, the nuke exemplifies America's failures in Iraq and Afghanistan, where in the aftermath of the War on Terror, it illustrates the fertility of these conflicts where nothing was gained other than death. However, the game can also be interpreted as perpetuating ideas that justified America's invasion of Iraq, that weapons of mass destruction exist in this universe's metaphoric stand-in of Saddam Hussein, al-Assad. Even during 2007, as such accusations were disproven, the game still perpetuates the accusation that allowed pretext for America's invasion of Iraq. Witnessing such destruction now justifies whatever happens to the people responsible for such a tragedy, including Captain Price's torture and execution of al-Assad, which in and of itself is a war crime.
Why'd you do it? Where did you get the bomb? Who then?
As a result, the game also argues that the ends justify the means, in conjunction to the anti-war message of human suffering perpetuated when the bomb is detonated. This span of interpreting the text is a key feature that makes Call of Duty 4 stand out amongst others in the franchise, where there is no universal consensus as to whether the game inhibits an anti-war or pro-war message. Unfortunately, the nuance of Call of Duty 4 is sidelined in later games for patriotism and nationalist themes in Modern Warfare 2, which exemplify ideas of foreign invasion of the US and overcoming impossible odds. As a result, Call of Duty's depictions of war have ranged from scenes that are anti-war through death of the author to completely sidelining any nuance in favor of nationalist themes. Through perpetuating heroism, failing to adequately criticize propaganda and portray the psychological effects of war, alongside perpetuating jingoism and chauvinism, the Call of Duty franchise fails to create a substantial anti-war message. Usually, whenever a scene is interpreted as anti-war, it is through death of the author and the individual interpretation of the player, rather than deliberate intention by the developers. However, one Call of Duty game stands above others in the series for its willingness to honestly portray what war truly entails. While this interpretation is true through death of the author, it nevertheless provides the most consistent and honest message about war in the series, the time when Call of Duty reached for the stars, but never shot above the moon.
You got eyes on this race?
Affirmative.
We got it. Let's get in there.
Reyes, hang on!
Captain's duty is to get his men home alive, Staff Sergeant.
Always, Lieutenant.
Mission comes first. Omar's words, not mine.
I bring my men home, so we do both.
Now, if you don't have the will to make that kind of choice, then like me, you have no place being in command.
There will be no rest for the enemies of the front. We will continue to fight you inside and outside your fading world.
You lack what it takes to win this war.
I think I'm scared, sir.
Me too.
Hey, Nick.
Yeah.
You can do this. You're the best we've got.
Call of Duty Infinite Warfare is a game that never truly found its audience. Its reveal trailer received near-universal derision for taking the Call of Duty franchise out of the modern and historical settings that defined the franchise for over a decade, instead exuberating the science fiction themes that defined the advanced movement or experimental era of Call of Duty, which was deeply unpopular with Call of Duty fans. Furthermore, its release in between Battlefield 1 and Titanfall 2 resulted in it being sidelined from other first-person shooter games that year, where both games' critical and audience reception outshined Infinite Warfare during its release. While Infinite Warfare has gathered positive retrospectives in recent years for its character-driven single-player narrative and zombies mode, Infinite Warfare's campaign has been critically overlooked for its themes and introspection into the conduct and ideological framework that is embedded in warfare, relying less on brutal violence to portray the futility of war and instead portraying it through its critique of fascism, propaganda, and by putting its protagonist, and subsequently the player, through the burden of leadership. Focusing on analysing to what extent is the cost of human life necessary for victory, Infinite Warfare enables a nuanced approach in depicting war and the cost of victory required to achieve it. While it still exemplifies various issues that have always plagued the franchise, Infinite Warfare illustrates an unorthodox Call of Duty narrative that challenges the typical stereotypes, heroism, and cliches that are abundant throughout the franchise's single-player narratives. Infinite Warfare's narrative is a science fiction story that can be described simply as World War II in space. The game's lore is set hundreds of years in the future, where technology requires humanity to go to the outer reaches of the solar system to accommodate Earth's dwindling natural resources and failing climate. One faction that has appeared through space colonization is the Settlement Defense Front, the SDF, a violent, fascist, and nationalist empire that is seeking to expand its imperial ambitions to Earth. Led by Salon Koch, portrayed by Kit Harington, the SDF seek to destroy and eliminate everything Earth-born, launching a surprise attack on Geneva, Switzerland, where the United Nations Space Alliance, the UNSA, headquarters, is located, destroying most of its space navy. Through this invasion, we play as Nick Reyes, portrayed by Brian Bloom, who is also one of the game's co-writers. He discovers that the captain of one of the surviving ships, the Retribution, has died during the attack. As the highest-ranking officer on the ship, he is promoted to commander of the Retribution.
Lieutenant Reyes, I'm promoting you to the rank of commander. You are now the acting captain of Retribution.
Infinite Warfare's narrative focuses on themes such as the nature of propaganda, fascism, death, leadership, the extent to which sacrifice is necessary to achieve victory, and as a result, the human cost of warfare. Through a character-driven narrative, Infinite Warfare highlights these ideas to further an analysis of war that very few Call of Duty games have been able to accomplish. Propaganda is one method the game uses to subtly criticize the actions of wartime factions. While propaganda can be seen from the SDF in multiple levels, such as Operation Burnwater on the planet Titan, these posters are fairly generic and they don't offer much to dissect on the relationship between propaganda and war. However, one of the more interesting aspects of how propaganda is depicted in the game is through the UNSA. The first level, Black Sky, illustrates a magnitude of UNSA spacecraft that are paraded during Fleet Week, a parade that celebrates UNSA military technology and spacecraft.
Welcome to Fleet Week!
Fleet Week is a direct commentary of how actual militaries around the world parade air shows to demonstrate both spectacle and entertainment for the average citizen to drive recruitment. Reyes comments how
crowd's eating this thing up.
Public relations, Reyes.
It's propaganda, Salt. We lost 4 men and we're throwing a party.
This is a direct commentary of how militaries sanitize and deceive citizens on the nature of warfare by demonstrating the technical prowess of war machines for entertainment and propaganda purposes. Novaly argues that air shows and other methods of public relations are repeatedly used by the United States military to drive recruitment and influence the public on their military institutions. Infinite Warfare decries this propaganda by contrasting the Fleet Week parade with the battle intensity of the SDF invasion of Geneva immediately in the opening chapter, where civilian casualties and war crimes are abundant. This contrast highlights both the genocidal ideology of the SDF and the inherently violent nature of warfare. By highlighting this contrast, Infinite Warfare exemplifies how military institutions sanitize war for the public to proliferate recruitment and influence public opinion on military organizations. Another way the game directly comments on war propaganda is through news reports on the Retribution ship. A feature on the Retribution has news reports that illustrate your successful missions and accomplishments after a level is completed. These news reports are met with mixed reactions by crew members, which are both celebrated and detested by UNSA soldiers, including Soldat, as they often feature falsified reports on the true scale of the conflict.
News report is coming on about Geneva.
I'll hang back. News is bullshit.
One noteworthy example is after Black Sky, where the entire UNSA fleet except the Retribution and Tigris are destroyed. The news reports falsify the true nature on the extent of the destruction of the UNSA fleet, where a UNSA spokesperson insists that they are at full operational capacity.
The StratCom spokesman was quoted as saying, "Our orbital defenses are intact, and the fleet is holding strong."
Fleet is holding strong?
On the run.
Fleet.
This is Renee Seance in New Delhi.
It's propaganda BS. Same shit, different ball.
This propaganda demonstrated in the game is to portray how media and government institutions distort current military situations to avoid media backlash, resulting in political and societal pressure. This is further reinforced by Admiral Raines at the beginning of the game, arguing,
"They're politicians, Reyes. They'll wipe hell's ass with whatever flag keeps the smokestacks burning. To these men, the idea of mounting an offensive triggers a fresh and unplanned piss. Until there's war, the warriors aren't in charge."
But sir, by the time there's war, it's too late. Hesitation is a hole in the head. You drilled that into us relentlessly in flight school. Work the problem, respond.
Admiral Raines contends that pro-action against military aggression is unsound for politicians, as it causes a fresh and unplanned piss of political and societal pressure, preferring to maintain the status quo and keep discourse at a minimum than face potential political and social backlash of responding to SDF aggression. Therefore, through the in-game news outlet and Raines' commentary on the political nature of warfare, Infinite Warfare examines how propaganda is utilized in war and peacetime to both drive recruitment and maintaining social cohesion during wartime to avoid political backlash. Infinite Warfare also offers an unexpected examination and satire into the ideology of fascism through its main antagonistic force, the Settlement Defense Front. The antagonistic faction of Infinite Warfare are essentially cliché space Nazis, a trope commonly seen in science fiction since the works of Star Wars. Infinite Warfare offers a unique take on this trope through interweaving the game's opposing ideas on the theme of death and sacrifice. An illustration of the differing ideological perceptions surrounding death are contrasted between the two factions, the UNSA and the Settlement Defense Front.
Cloud's judgment. That is why you cannot win.
While the game's depiction of fascism is not as extensive nor timeless of a criticism of the ideology, such as the Wolfenstein Reboot series, which examines the oppressive nature of totalitarianism and race science through the eyes of those who are victims of fascism and Nazism, Infinite Warfare, while not an analysis of these concepts, is still nevertheless a more potent examination into the ideology of fascism than what is traditionally expected in a Call of Duty campaign. Because Infinite Warfare's narrative is not based on historical or modern events and is a purely science fiction story, it allows the game to examine fascism on ideology rather than aesthetic grounds, avoiding the problematic element of past Call of Duty titles of whitewashing fascism by using aesthetics and symbols to portray fascism rather than directly analyzing the ideological background of the ideology in the series' World War II counterparts. One method that the game examines war and fascism is through the ideological difference on the perception of death between the game's main factions, the UNSA and the Settlement Defense Front. Death and its consequences to achieve victory is a major key philosophical point of conflict that drives the narrative. The SDF, who see death as a necessary feat for victory in war, utilize the motto, "Death is no disgrace." This is repeated multiple times in the narrative by the main antagonist, Salen Koch.
This is Admiral Salen Koch of the Olympus Mons. You were defeated. Death is no disgrace. Death is no disgrace.
Death is no disgrace.
The phrase echoes the fascistic slogan, "Viva la muerte," long live death, a motto used by Joans Milan Astre in the Spanish Phalange, a fascist political ideology in Spain that militarily supported Francisco Franco's nationalist forces during the Spanish Civil War. Mark Neocleus argues that the relationship between death and fascism goes far beyond normal Western ideals of commemoration and memory. Instead, an important ideological component of fascism is how it refers to a direct philosophy of life which immortalizes death. Fascist regimes, such as Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, were preoccupied by the idea of immortality through death, as through sheer faith in ideology, they can be immortalized. Fascism thinks of the dead as in some sense either alive or as possessing the possibility of becoming alive once more, exemplifying the concept of resurrection through dying. Nazi ideology and propaganda greatly subscribed to the idea of immortality through death. This idea was used by Hitler in his speeches for propaganda purposes. Hitler stated in his November 8, 1935 speech for commemorating the Bierhochputsch in Munich, "These 16 soldiers have celebrated a resurrection unique in world history. They are now attaining German immortality, yet for us they are not dead, and made today the dead of our movement, Germany and its men, living and dead, live on." Nazi and fascist propaganda deeply expanded on celebrating the dead through death, because there was little distinction between the living and the dead, as faith in the ideology immortalizes the fascist. Furthermore, this idea of death is proliferated through Mussolini himself, who exemplified the concept in his pamphlet, The Doctrine of Fascism. He argued that the years preceding the March on Rome cover a period during which the need for action forbade delay and careful doctrinal elaborations. Fighting was going on in towns and villages. There were discussions, but there was something more sacred and more important: death. Fascists knew how to die. A doctrine fully elaborated, divided up into chapters and paragraphs with annotations, may have been lacking, but it was replaced by something more decisive, by a faith. Mussolini argues that through sheer faith alone, the fascists can be immortalized or emit a resurrection, in Hitler's words, to become everlasting through an uncompromising faith towards the ideology, encouraging people to sacrifice themselves for the movement and the nation, as the living and the dead are considered one of the same. Furthermore, this fascist perspective on death is, according to Zambonardi, a form of sacrificial death, where the death of the soldier is seen as a glorious and noble endeavour. This attitude is reflected in both fascist regimes and in 19th century conflicts such as the Franco-Prussian War and World War I, where soldiers' lives were seen as expendable for the cause of empire and the nation. With this context, the SDF exhibit an ideology of worshipping not the fallen, but the idea of dying itself, embodying the idea of sacrificial death. One way the game highlights this ideology is through the death quotes when the player dies. Call of Duty death screens usually feature inspiring quotes to encourage the player to continue playing. Infinite Warfare instead provides quotes that berate the player's inferiority to the SDF. These quotes also provide lore into the regime's ideology of ultranationalism, hierarchies that subjugate women in auxiliary and procreation roles, and an intensive surveillance culture. One important quote attributed to Salen Koch states, we do not mourn the dead, we arm the living, calling for military action rather than grieving the dead. This philosophy is enacted by Koch in Operation Black Flag as he attempts to destroy Geneva through the Olympus Mons self-destruct system rather than lose the ship to the boarding Retribution crew.
You will not take my carrier, Captain Ray. We will all die here. I will detonate this vessel and level your city.
Come and get me, Koch. Leave your bridge. Pick up a weapon and fight.
We don't fight. We attack.
This philosophy by Koch that dying is more sacred to advance the fascist cause is tantamount to Mussolini's idea that fascists knew how to die with regard to the need for action to advance the ideology, thus demonstrating that the SDF worshipped death as a method of advancing the goal of fascism. Moreover, SDF soldiers express celebration and a longing desire to die, demonstrated when Raya, a sleeper agent, attempts to destroy the ATIS defense system during the level Black Sky.
Security, I want eyes in that room.
Yes, sir. Streaming to your HUDs now.
10 ships remain. The UNSA fleet is finished. Moving to ATIS system destruct now. Mars eternal.
While the celebratory atmosphere in the short camera feed clip may be due to their celebration of incoming victory, the destruction of this weapon system would also result in their deaths. This can be interpreted as SDF soldiers demonstrating a lack of distinction between being alive and dying, similar to Hitler's description of how the living and dead live on through sheer faith in ideology. Furthermore, SDF soldiers express a willingness to die with their comrades in battle, as evident by SDF soldier banter during Operation Deep Execute.
I prepared my whole life for this moment. I had remorse standing idle as our kindred died in honor on foreign ground.
Yes, regrettable if the war was over before we have our chance to shed foul earthborn blood.
Emphasizing a willing desire to die as they prepared their whole lives for their moment to die for the cause. Hence, illustrating that the SDF military culture encourages and celebrates contributing to the ideology of fascism by simply dying. The desire to die is not just reflected through minor NPCs, but through the secondary antagonist, Raya, who is the embodiment of this concept. His purpose in the narrative is to bring the SDF fleet to Earth, accomplished through using a transporter in his abdomen that would trigger with his suicide. His character represents the fascistic obsession with death and rebirth, as his motivating goal is to die for the SDF cause.
This is true courage.
Those!
The signal is lost. My fleet lands here.
Furthermore, his obsession with rebirth is reflected on the most wanted board in Reyes' office, where Raya's card is the Ace of Diamonds, a typical card in a 52 stack that symbolizes new beginnings through ambition and precision. Raya embodies these qualities in his goal to die for his fascist ideology through sheer faith, as Mussolini discussed in his Doctrine of Fascism. Therefore, through his commitment to dying and symbolism of rebirth, Raya exemplifies an ideological component of fascism that views death both as a necessity for victory and a chance to be part of the resurrection to achieve immortality. The SDF's obsession with military pro-action is directly related to fascist concepts surrounding death and rebirth, allowing the game to satirize fascism through the SDF's military culture and the expressed desire of its leadership and soldiers to die for the fascist cause to extreme lengths. While the SDF viewed death as a method of rebirth, idealizing the concept of dying for the nation, the protagonist faction, the UNSA, view death as a tragedy and seek to honor those who died in warfare as a form of remembrance. This perspective of death is commonly demonstrated in Western countries, which downgrade the idea of sacrificial virtue for one's country in favor of seeing soldiers as victims in conflict. Zambonati demonstrates this as irrecoverable death, as memorials and cultural monuments have shifted from portraying war as a noble endeavour into a senseless act of violence. The UNSA are shown to demonstrate this Western cultural norm of irrecoverable death through its willingness to honour the dead through monuments that list the names of people who have died during the Succession War. This Remembrance Monument is the first playable area as Nick Reyes, acting as subtle foreshadowing for the game's ending.
Not a list you want to make.
Peace to the fallen.
The motto, Peace to the Fallen, illustrates respect to those who have died in conflict, and a wish for them to achieve peace after witnessing the horrors of war.
Kashima?
KIA, Lieutenant. Gibson 2.
Peace to the fallen.
Peace to the fallen. Peace to the fallen.
Thus, exemplifying irrecoverable death through the UNSA's willingness to honour those who died in conflict. Another idea embodied in the game is how leadership and the cost of warfare is interwoven through the game's preconception of death, and the burden of having people's lives on the line due to the leader's actions. One method the game employs is the ability to humanize the Retribution ship and its crew members on it. Crew members have various discussions between themselves, including small talk, such as the ongoing events of the war, sometimes even coming to terms with near-death experiences.
You alright? Yeah. Doc cleared me. But they weren't too lucky on the other end of the hall I was in. 3 steps forward and I would have been gone. Shit.
They interact and comment to Reyes on his performance in various campaign missions.
There's our ace. Solid move down there, sir.
Perform maintenance on the ship itself, and engage in their day-to-day jobs. The Retribution is a ship that feels alive, as if hundreds have their own individual stories to tell. Furthermore, the relationship you have between your crewmates, such as Ethan, Soldat, and Omar, allows the player to form bonds between them, as the banter between these characters feels organic and real.
Troop ready model. Quite remarkable. We're revealing him at the ceremony today.
You know I got stage fright, right, sir?
You got feelings, Ethan?
I do, Lieutenant. I do. I carry the brain of a human farmer.
Holy shit, are you serious?
No, ma'am. Not at all.
He got you, Lieutenant.
Did not.
These in-world features allow the crew members of the Retribution to be humanized as more than just simple AI bots the player is forced to work with during the campaign.
Ethan! What's the Navy's official policy for a gunfight?
Send in the Marines!
While some of the character arcs are rushed to a certain degree, such as the relationship between Omar and Ethan, the character interactions and development are far more extensive than other Call of Duty campaigns, such as Ghosts, where the extent of their characterization is minimal and lackluster. These moments of characterization add real depth to Infinite Warfare's world and the leadership role the player undertakes, providing a more believable world than other fictional worlds that Call of Duty has created. An important idea to mention is how, despite the game taking place on a massive ship with a large cast of characters, Infinite Warfare contrasts its fleshed out crew members and characters with an unbearably lonely atmosphere that highlights the importance of the job as commander of the Retribution. This feeling of loneliness is depicted through various elements in the game. Firstly, the game's music, created by Schachner, differs greatly from other Call of Duty games. Whereas previous Call of Duty games utilize heavy guitar strings, full orchestral bodies with a heavy emphasis on trumpets to promote heroism and pushing past incredible odds, such as Modern Warfare 2, Infinite Warfare's campaign subtracts from these instruments in place of quiet violins, echoes, piano, and electronic synths to portray an emotional response of loneliness. Tracks, such as Anthropic Universe, highlight the vastness of space that evokes an almost existential feeling of dread, highlighting the ugliness of war in space. Reyes, the main theme for the protagonist, does not evoke any sense of heroism, rather reinforcing the idea that the player, or in this case Reyes, is the one responsible for every soul on the Retribution, incentivizing a sense of weight of leadership to the player through the game's music. Secondly, the ship is often noisy and loud with crew members talking, machinery and computers in full operational capacity. This noise is only subtracted the moment the player enters the bridge or the commander's office. Where the only sound admitted is from the player themselves, as only they are allowed in this area given its high-ranking status on the ship. This exclusivity to the player enriches an already lonely atmosphere that highlights the burden as role of commander of the Retribution. Therefore, through the game's soundtrack and atmosphere, Infinite Warfare minimizes heroism by demonstrating a mature tone to reinforce the game's themes on the burden of being commander of the Retribution. Another important concept related to leadership is how one responds to death in warfare, which is intertwined with how the UNSA preconceives death. Reyes' entire character arc is based on his internalized conflict on whether a leader should focus on getting their soldiers back home or allowing them to die in order to complete the mission at all costs.
All due respect, Lieutenant. The captain did his duty. He drove the enemy into retreat.
Captain's duty is to get his men home alive, Staff Sergeant.
Not always, Lieutenant. Not always.
Most characters, such as Omar and Soldat, argue that completing the mission at all costs is a priority over the lives of everyone. However, Omar and Soldat's character arcs result in them attempting to save someone to no avail. Omar argues the mission is more important, but dies trying to save a civilian in Operation Dark Quarry.
Ship's taking heat! Asteroid's unstable! Imperative we pull out! I'm going for him! No, we don't have time! Omar! Son of a... Stand by! We're holding for Omar!
Similarly, Soldat also attests the mission is more important in the beginning of the narrative, but argues at the end of the game that she can save Reyes and the rest of the team to no avail.
Mission comes first. Omar's words, not mine.
I bring my men home, Salt. We do both. Do as much damage as you can before SDF takes you out.
I can do both. I can hit the shipyard and drop out of here.
You won't have time.
Watch me.
Fire on my position, Salter!
I can't do that, Nick!
Nora, finish the mission! That's an order!
This is in contrast to Reyes, who wishes to save all of his crew members, as he gradually realizes that death is necessary to complete the mission. Reyes' arc occurs over the course of the game as a result of each death he experiences close to him. The first major character death being Omar, which his argument with Soldat on whether he could have been saved results in him giving her the green light to
Let's keep the barrel side out. Fight the enemy, not each other. You got the green light to do whatever it takes.
Farron, the leader of the Tigress ship, is killed by the Olympus Mons while they were distracted with a civilian rescue mission. Farron's death results in Reyes to take proper leadership over his army to lure the Olympus into a trap.
Staff Sergeant Omar said to pick your mission. Don't let it pick you. That's exactly what we're gonna do.
Furthermore, Farron's death is important for Reyes' arc because it highlights how empathy in war results in the SDF abusing said empathy to gain a tactical edge, enforcing the idea to Reyes that empathy over strategy in warfare results in only more people getting killed. Another important character death is Kashima, whose death reinforces the fragility of human life and uselessness of war through tangible game interactivity. In a moment out of the Kojima playbook which highlights the poignancy of youth mortality, the player is forced in a QuickTime event to hold down the controller's triggers to prevent Kashima from bleeding out.
Sorry, sir. Always have been a bleeder.
Don't worry, Cash.
The console versions of the game have the controller vibrate to Kashima's heartbeat as he slowly bleeds out, ceasing entirely when he dies. The use of tangible controller vibrations highlights the inevitability of death and youth mortality in war, as Brooks fails to find medical equipment to save Kashima's life. Furthermore, the relationship between death and war is illustrated through Kashima's final words to Reyes.
Is that rain, sir?
This highlights the natural relationship between death and war. When the player enters Mars for the first time, just before Kashima's death, debris from destroyed warships rain from the sky, similar to Kashima's comment of seeing rain before his passing. Rain in many cultures symbolizes the sorrow and melancholy of death. Kashima here insinuates through his last words that war and death are correlated and cannot be separated from each other. Hence, Kashima's death highlights the uselessness of youth mortality through the game's tangible storytelling and the symbolism of rain that illustrates death as an unavoidable component of armed conflict. The idea of death being an interconnected element of warfare is highlighted through one of its most important characters. Ultimately, it is McCallum, Mac, portrayed by Claudia Black, who reinforces this theme in the narrative. She is the main driving force of Infinite Warfare's philosophical debate about the burden of leadership and how war imposes death on those who wage it. Her discussions with Reyes highlight to what extent it is a commander's responsibility when sending people to die in conflict.
Good work, Chief. We can use every edge.
Oh, I understand. I once stood in your shoes, Commander.
You were a captain, Mac? Why'd you give up your commission?
I committed the mortal sin that can break a commander in two. I cared.
We all care, Chief.
Ordering men into battle isn't for everyone. So the machines are now in my hands, and we're all in yours, Captain.
With this context, McCallum is the most important character in the narrative, as she serves to highlight that for victory to be achieved, death is a natural consequence of war, and it requires using all logistics and manpower in order to wage it. Mac's ultimate thematic purpose in the narrative is to highlight how death is unavoidable in war, and using all logistics available is required to achieve victory over the SDF.
He saved his ship and crew, Chief, and that's noble,
But the shipyard remains intact. Look, the strength of the pack is in all the wolves, Captain. All in, no matter the cost. They were ready. Now, if you don't have the will to make that kind of choice, then like me, you have no place being in command.
I couldn't ram my own ship. I would have killed them.
They came to win. This doesn't look like victory.
McCallum's philosophy of using every soldier to fight is a reflection of the tactics of total war, which requires the effort of all personnel, equipment, and gear for victory to be achieved. McCallum argues that for the UNSA to succeed against the SDF, it requires utilizing the strength of the pack is in all the wolves, necessitating all tools that the commander has to fight against the SDF. Her commitment to the mission at all costs is emphasized by her own death in Operation Bloodstorm, as she sacrifices herself to save Reyes and pleads him to complete the mission, implying even at the cost of his own life.
Please! The mission! Let go! Damn it, Mac! Why'd she do that?
She did that so we keep going. The others are still counting on us.
Mac's observation that death is necessary in war is essential for Reyes' arc, as he progresses from wanting to preserve life as much as possible to encouraging his soldiers to do what it takes to finish the mission, even at the cost of their own lives.
You'll never make it back to the ship. If we wait, they'll fire on us.
You're not gonna wait.
Captain. How will you get home?
No one's going home.
Did you know we were gonna finish this here?
No. I think Mac did.
Infinite Warfare does not discuss or argue on whether the actions of Reyes or McCallum's philosophy on war are justified, though the game implies that Reyes' actions in hesitating to destroy the shipyard dooms the entirety of the Retribution's crew to inevitable and slow death on Mars, as evident by the intense amount of death the player witnesses when landing on Mars, which also includes Kashima. While the game never explicitly states, "This is all your fault," like Spec Ops: The Line, the game implies through Reyes' hesitation that he is responsible for the deaths of everyone on the Retribution, emphasizing the weight of Reyes' leadership decisions resulting in the deaths of everyone on the ship. Because of the game's preoccupation with death as a necessity to complete the mission, other Call of Duty games would signify this theme as the ends justifying the means, such as that of Modern Warfare 2019 and Black Ops. However, the ending of Infinite Warfare highlights the pointlessness of the conflict and does not fall into the traditional Call of Duty predicaments of correlating death and victory with heroism. Reyes' death is unceremonious, and is followed by text detailing that the mission was successful. The SDF shipyard was destroyed, at the cost of 763 casualties and only 4 survivors. Reyes' name on the war memorial is unheroic, as his name is just another one of the hundreds who died during the conflict. The ending displays UNSA propaganda highlighting the heroism of Reyes and Soldat, falsifying that she too died on the mission and fantasizing it as a noble endeavor against impossible odds.
Both officers, aware of the imminent danger, in spite of extensive casualties planned and skillfully executed, an attack with unwavering devotion to their duty. Commander Reyes and Lieutenant Soldat gallantly offered their own lives and those of their crew, mobilizing at close range against superior firepower.
The UNSA's attempt to glorify the actions of Reyes and Soldat through a war memorial dedicated to remembrance illustrate how cultural artifacts are twisted to suit the needs of military propaganda, subverting the message of these cultural monuments and twisting them for political purposes. Soldat's final words to her friend,
"Peace to the fallen,"
highlight this discrepancy between how military propaganda sanctifies heroism and sacrifice in contrast to how the average soldier reinforces irrecoverable death to those who died in conflict, highlighting a major discontent between how military propaganda portrays war and the real impact of those who experience war firsthand. Furthermore, the death letters at the end credits add weight to the game's theme about the futility of war by highlighting the individual stories of people on the Retribution. Death letters, also known as death notifications in the military, are written letters to the deceased family or next of kin informing them of their deaths. While the main purposes of the side characters in Infinite Warfare is to die for plot and thematic convenience, and often feature little development juxtaposed to the main cast, the game manages to both humanize and give insight into their lives, including their reasons for joining the military, their memories with family members.
Mom, I had a dream last night that you were making dinner. Yes, my favorite pork chops. And we were all at the table together.
Saying their final goodbyes to their loved ones.
My dearest children. Well, as this letter will only be used in the event of my death, it may seem somewhat sorrowful, but I don't want you to see it that way, okay? I have always felt that our stay on Earth, the time we call life, it's a temporary gift to be spent in service of something greater than ourselves. Death comes to us all. It is not to be feared.
Whereas other characters like Griff are not able to make amends with their family relationships, highlighting that some people aren't able to have a proper final goodbye on good terms.
Sir? I'm not quite sure how a son greets his father after not seeing him for a lifetime. I guess I say hi to heaven. I forgive you for leaving. I hope you're not mad at me for writing.
The point of Infinite Warfare's poignant end credits is to highlight the humanity of the cast and to exemplify the pointlessness of the conflict, where the mission success at the end of the game is a Pythric victory where both the UNSA and the SDF's military capabilities are completely and utterly destroyed. No faction wins at the end of Infinite Warfare, and the only thing left are the voices of the dead and a statistic. This ending in Infinite Warfare is a major departure from the series' traditional depictions of heroism in its narrative conclusions, which often feature heroic deaths burials, and patriotism laced into its endings, such as Black Ops and Modern Warfare 3. The second one. By subverting these expectations in a Call of Duty campaign, the game is able to provide a capable message about the destructive nature of warfare, illustrating the pointlessness of the war between the SDF and the UNSA, and highlighting the human cost that warfare brings. While Infinite Warfare is a far more meaningful campaign than a typical Call of Duty story would entail, it still nevertheless includes various issues that have plagued the franchise for over 2 decades. One of these is the lack of psychological insight into its characters on how war changes them. Infinite Warfare does not examine how the war changes Reyes, nor the other characters' psychological state. Although his character model becomes slightly dirtier at the end of the game to signify his change in character, it is still extremely minimal of a character design that isn't even noticeable unless specified. This lack of psychological impact that war brings to the characters in the Infinite Warfare is a detriment to the game being able to fully criticize the impact that war brings on the people who engage in it. Moreover, Infinite Warfare does not go into an extensive detail as to why hostilities between the SDF and the UNSA have been occurring. Although the in-game map and lore pieces highlight that sanctions against the SDF for human rights violations led to the SDF seeing it as an attack on their sovereignty, leading to the mission Black Sky. The game's lore does not examine the historical hostilities between the UNSA and SDF in grave detail, nor does it examine the reasons for why the SDF fascist movement occurred. This is a weakness of the game's worldbuilding, as it reinforces the traditional binary good versus evil plotlines that have embroiled the entire franchise, preventing the player from understanding why Mars turned to fascism or being able to understand life under the SDF. However, some minor elements of Infinite Warfare storytelling do enrich the world, such as the game's environmental storytelling on the impact of civilian life on Titan, where many are sent to labor camps by the SDF, and the game's deliberate intention to have the backdrop of the war be over resources, helping to reinforce traditional theories about why warfare occurs, in contrast to the nationalist or terrorism-related causes of war in other Call of Duty games such as Modern Warfare. It is also important to mention that Infinite Warfare, like Call of Duty 4 before it, the developer's intention was not to critically analyze war, as its narrative and storytelling ambitions from the onset were to be a character-driven, Hollywood-inspired military war story set in space. Game director Jacob Minkoff argues the game's storytelling is based on the playable Hollywood blockbuster.
Call of Duty is fast, silky smooth controls, tense, adrenaline rush, super realistic. It was a playable Black Hawk Down.
With a traditional Hollywood film structure, and no loading screens to make the game more immersive than others in the series. Furthermore, he argues that the game's narrative ambitions of making a seamless experience reinforces the Top Gun fantasy, as the game's space battles and vehicle sections are seamlessly woven into the fiction of the character and the mechanics of the game to further the immersion of the narrative, emphasizing an emotional, character-driven narrative with epic space battles rather than actually critiquing the effects of war. Nevertheless, one of the developer's narrative intentions was to make a story with the protagonist as a leader rather than an everyday soldier in previous games.
I want the player to feel what it means to be a leader of men, a leader of soldiers in warfare, and have to make tough decisions and live with those decisions.
Which helps to uplift ideas such as the weight of making decisions during wartime. Whether it was intentional of the developers to create a message about war through this narrative device is uncertain. Regardless, Infinite Warfare's focus on a character-driven narrative with emotional story beats, while examining the burden of leadership during wartime, unintentionally helps to proliferate a criticism of war through the leadership role the player is given. The game developers argued, "We thought it would be really interesting to take that protagonist on a journey, in real time, where he has to change his perspective from that viewpoint to one of a commander with thousands of troops, where the view is more about the mission comes first, and dealing with the burden of that leadership and those choices that you have to make. That's what we wanted to tell, And that kind of story, we can find examples in literature, in movies, in TV, where that kind of story is being told in lots of different settings. By forcing the player to come to terms with the extent it is necessary to send people, especially those close to them, to die in warfare, the game creates a criticism of war that other Call of Duty games fail to communicate to its audience. While the developers may not have intended for the game to have a proficient anti-war message, the game's major themes about the weight of leadership and the nature of death and sacrifice, alongside its ending, help to enable a criticism of war where other Call of Duty games falter.
Ladies and gentlemen, we do not fight here to win. Our battle is so that those we fight for do not lose. There are billions of people back home who don't know what we're doing, but they will know exactly what we've done.
That being said, the lack of intent on critically examining war is why the game cannot be a true anti-war game. Instead, the developers created a hard science fiction story based on the artistic works of James Cameron and Robert A. Heinlein, with further inspiration to live up to the narrative legacy of Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare.
I want people to play our new game and say like, wow, I haven't seen COD change so much since Modern Warfare.
A game whose moments were defined by levels that enhanced introspection through its narrative moments and memorable characters. This enabled players to create their own interpretation out of the game's narrative, proliferating a criticism of war that came from death of the author rather than through deliberate intention by the developers. Henceforth, Infinity Ward may or may not have intended to make a game that is a criticism of war, but nevertheless created a game whose narrative ambitions on making an anti-war statement were just as nuanced as the game it inspired to live up to. Through an examination of propaganda, fascism, leadership, and a scrutiny on the necessity of death to obtain victory through unheroic means, Infinite Warfare provides an unconventional message that deviates from the series' mainline traditions of portraying heroism and sanctifying it as a noble endeavour. It is a rare example of a Call of Duty game displaying a coherent message about war that doesn't fall into the trap of nationalist propaganda that has embroiled the series for over the last 2.5 decades. Portraying a depiction of warfare that embodies the hardships of leadership and the necessity of loss required to obtain that victory. As a result, Call of Duty Infinite Warfare has been critically misunderstood as simply the Call of Duty game in space, and the negative reception at its announcement reinforced it post-release as a Call of Duty game that sought to chase the science fiction trends of FPS games released during the 2010s. At a time when players were tired of the science fiction tropes that define the experimental advanced movement era of the series. The reality of its messaging and its themes make this reputation of the game further from the truth. Infinite Warfare's nuanced depiction of leadership and its effects enable the campaign to be amongst the strongest entries in the franchise, rivaling Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare's implied critiques on war and the nature of American interventionism, demonstrating a far more representative examination of what true Modern Warfare entails than the actual Modern Warfare reboot series. Consequently, crafting a highly cohesive Call of Duty narrative with proper themes and introspection that makes it stand tall amongst the series' best single-player campaigns. However, despite Infinite Warfare's themes about leadership and the consequences of sacrifice and death in war, it is more of a science fiction military story rather than an anti-war narrative, and it is foolish to consider it a true anti-war game. Despite this, Infinite Warfare is nevertheless the most honest depiction in a Call of Duty game of what warfare truly demands, that is, loss and death. War is ugly and horrifying, and Infinite Warfare, whether intentional or not, illustrates war as an endeavour where nobody wins, from those in leadership, to the average soldier, to the civilian victims of war, and the unheard cries of those who lose their sons and daughters to conflict. This leads into a major question that has plagued the Call of Duty franchise for decades. Why is it that Call of Duty struggles to maintain a coherent statement against war? Why is the franchise embroiled in binary good versus evil stories that have defined its narratives? Why does it struggle to make a political statement on the current state of geopolitics? Is Infinite Warfare an exception to this rule, or is it an intentional proprietor of it? Call of Duty stories almost always include a black and white good versus evil narrative that is commonly intertwined with the franchise's tropes. There are good guys, usually American, British, or other Western-backed groups, while the villains are cold-blooded murderers supporting terrorism, usually Russian or Middle Eastern groups. Sometimes there are American villains in the series, such as Jonathan Irons in Advanced Warfare, but they are often portrayed as being a simple case of being a bad apple, rather than being an actual critique on the systemic problems in the American military or society for that matter. Call of Duty as a whole needs a villain or antagonistic force to support its narrative, reinforcing the traditional binary narrative in order to help enforce an idea that is commonplace in the franchise. This idea is known as protagonist-centered morality. It is deeply rooted in the psyche of Call of Duty games. Protagonist-centered morality proclaims that the immoral actions of the protagonist are justified because they are the heroes, and commit to doing such actions for the greater good, whereas similar actions by the antagonists are unjustifiable and perform these actions for purposes of harm and evil. Call of Duty's narrative premises are based on protagonist-centered morality, as the actions of the protagonist are seen as keeping the peace or utilized for the greater good. Not even Infinite Warfare is safe from this problematic trope. While Infinite Warfare can be interpreted as criticizing war, the game can also be seen from a pro-war slant. The SDF are portrayed as the stereotypical evil whose only goal is the destruction of Earth. The destruction of the UNSA fleet at Geneva in Black Sky and the intense civilian deaths from the genocidal actions of the SDF justify an intense response from the UNSA, where even some crew members can be heard emphasizing revenge.
Peace? After what they did to us? That dude's out of his damn mind. We should be turning Mars to glass. To hell with all of them.
No, just ship his ass there. See how diplomacy works out for him.
Despite capturing the Olympus Mons and killing Admiral Koch, destroying the SDF fleet and shipyard in return is a valid response that results in the deaths of thousands and, in turn, kills almost the entirety of Reyes' own crew on the Retribution. The game never ponders the morality of killing so many in response to the invasion, nor does it ask whether Reyes is actually the villain of the story for dooming the lives of everyone on the ship. The game frames these deaths as a natural part of war and could not have been avoided. One key area that highlights this idea is Reyes commanding a Sato pilot to kamikaze himself for the UNSA troops to progress, as there is no other option to get rid of the blockage.
Negative 2-5 is weapons dry. I got nothing left, sir.
2-5, you gotta hit those positions. We are out of options.
Understood, Commander. I'll ram the gun sight. Fair wind, sir. Good luck.
In this respect, Infinite Warfare unintentionally endorses the idea that to go beyond the Call of Duty is to die for the mission, for the cause, even if these actions parallel the fascist ideas that are entrenched in SDF ideology. In some respects, Infinite Warfare might be the most Call of Duty game there is, as the goodness of the heroes is preserved, even when they commit acts that they criticize their enemies for doing, and the antagonists are quintessentially evil for those actions and cannot be redeemed. Regardless of Infinite Warfare having protagonist-centered morality, the game's writing allows it to have nuance on whether or not the game exhibits an anti-war or pro-war message similar to Call of Duty 4. The game never denounces nor celebrates Reyes for his actions that lead to the deaths of his crew on the Retribution, allowing players to discuss whether Reyes and Mac's philosophy on war was moral or immoral in sacrificing the entire crew for the mission. giving the game far more nuance than other Call of Duty games, in contrast to other entries in the series that lack introspection into its themes and justify the actions of the protagonists, irrespective of their actions. Other Call of Duty games utilize protagonist-centered morality to justify the morality of the protagonists. In Modern Warfare 2019, the secondary antagonist, a terrorist titled The Butcher, assaults the US Embassy in Urzikstan in a mission inspired by the Benghazi US Embassy attack of 2012. The Butcher massacres many civilians, including acts of torture and the murder of a child in front of the game's protagonists.
Mercy is weak.
The infamous interrogation sequence against the Butcher later in the game, in order to find the location of a chemical weapon, Nikolai kidnaps the Butcher's wife and child as a prop for a torture sequence.
We know nothing!
For negotiation. Perhaps the Butcher will have a change of heart.
The game attempts to explore the nuance of the protagonist's extremely immoral ethics. However, at every possible turn, the sequence and the entire game delineates these actions as a necessity to prevent further calamity, which is further exemplified in Clean House.
They were going to kill me! They locked me in here!
Drop her.
Stop!
Clear. Oh, fucking hell. She was going for a bloody detonator.
Good job we dropped her then.
We made the right call, sir.
The game frames the torture sequence in the narrative as an exciting and tense confrontation that uses unethical means as a justified response for the greater good, even when such actions result in the harm of innocent people.
Where do we draw the line, sir?
You draw the line wherever you need it, Sergeant. End of the day, someone has to make the enemy scared of the dark.
As a result, it justifies the actions of the protagonists as a necessity for the benefit of peace, and their heroism is preserved rather than compromised. This aspect of Call of Duty is deeply rooted in its identity, where the protagonists of the story are justified in their actions because they are the heroes, from glorifying violence in World at War to defending corrupt institutions in Black Ops, justifying torture in Modern Warfare, and to
You got the green light to do whatever it takes.
in Infinite Warfare. The series always includes the protagonists as the unequivocal good guys who cannot do anything wrong. This ideology is the underpinning philosophy of Captain Price's famous quote,
"We get dirty, and the world stays clean,"
endorsing the protagonists as morally righteous regardless of their actions. This inevitably causes problems for games such as Modern Warfare and Black Ops, which feature stand-ins for real conflicts such as the now-ended Syrian Civil War, the Gulf War, and allegories for Russian and American intervention in the Middle East. These are deliberate intentions by the game's developers, and the simplification of these conflicts are done so that they are, quote, more easily grokkable to mainstream audiences, simplifying real conflicts and wars to make the narratives more digestible and removing ideas that might be too confronting for mainstream audiences. As a result, protagonist-centered morality prevents the series from dissecting real-world politics because the binary fantasy of good and evil cannot apply to stories that attempt to capture the nuance and shades of grey of real conflicts, as they often feature real countries, real war crimes, and real people that are simplified and, at worst, distorted, such as the Highway of Death, for mainstream Call of Duty players, preventing these narratives from having any subtlety on tackling the real issues of modern conflicts ongoing today. The narrative effects of protagonist-centered morality affect Call of Duty economically and culturally, specifically its relationship to the military entertainment complex. Tim Lenoir and Luke Cadwell's The Military Entertainment Complex examine how media corporations create narratives that fantasize the military to influence public perception on how warfare is conducted. The book argues that the biggest proprietor of these depictions of war in gaming is not enacted by military or by government propaganda to influence the public on war, although it is undeniable that military consultation has contributed to these depictions. It is rather economic and market-oriented consumerism that incentivizes corporations to make unrealistic depictions of war appealing in service of gaining a larger audience and gaining larger profits, making them seem realistic to distort war from a traumatic endeavor into a reputable source of entertainment. Tim Lenoir and Luke Cadwell argue that games like Call of Duty shift the depiction of war from authenticity to plausibility as a way to create engagement for mass market consumers. The book maintains that war is not intrinsically fun. It requires significant reworking to create the exciting experiences gamers expect and support, focusing less on realism and more on plausible ideas about the military to enhance player retention and make these games mass marketable. This form of depiction is important for the aesthetics of the modern military shooter genre and games such as Call of Duty. To create experiences that enforce high engagement, authenticity on the reality of war is minimized, and instead create probable ideas about war where they are accepted by mainstream audiences as a part of the wartime experience. Game mechanics are not created to enhance the realism of the player experience, but to make the games themselves more engaging and exciting. Mechanics such as grappling hooks, diving, and sliding are used to enhance the already fast-paced nature of Call of Duty multiplayer matches. Furthermore, its deeply involved progression system encourages player retention to keep coming back. These mechanics are not limited to Call of Duty, but other modern military shooters such as Battlefield, where realism is used as an aesthetic smokescreen to create highly involved fantasies about war that are not authentic, but have enough plausible concepts about the military to the average player to make the experience more appealing. These mechanics have no basis in military reality, and more often than not, inspiration comes more from popular culture than real conflicts. For example, Battlefield 6's campaign and narrative was directly inspired by recent films such as Civil War and TV shows such as Lioness, rather than actual wartime experiences. Battlefield 4 reportedly did not employ any military experts at all, instead inviting a local hobbyist who collects military gear to play dress up. DICE's founder Patrick Batch reportedly stated, "If it looks cool, it goes into the game. If additional research is necessary, YouTube is sufficient for their purposes." Similarly, Call of Duty behind-the-scenes footage, including that of Infinite Warfare, included developers emphasizing the cinematic elements that inspire Call of Duty games, including films such as Black Hawk Down.
Adrenaline rush, super realistic. It was a playable Black Hawk Down.
These modern military shoot-up narratives have no basis in reality, instead prioritizing plausible ideas about the military to make them seem realistic in order to appeal to mass-market audiences. It enables the actual realities of war to be distorted by the creators in order for them to become deeply compelling gaming experiences that consumers will play over long periods of time, allowing the perceptions of the reality of war to be distorted and to make the experience more interesting and engaging. Tim Lenoir writes, "This shift from authenticity to plausibility is perhaps the most important aesthetic contribution of modern wargaming to the military entertainment complex. More accurately, the move from authenticity to plausibility is so effectively compelling that expectations about reality are inevitably reframed. In selling an entertainment experience, a game maker presents war in a highly condensed and distilled form. Whatever real world it mirrors not only has had all the boring parts removed, but also is expanded in such extreme ways that reality itself becomes much less interesting. By allowing games to focus on plausible elements rather than genuine military authenticity, modern military shooters help to sanitize war and its effects by focusing on making the experience cool and engaging in search of a larger audience. This is how game narratives are created, by focusing on nostalgia and binary narratives alongside using protagonist-centered morality to fulfill player expectations on what is expected in a military shooter. Call of Duty relies on mass market appeal to bring in as many people to purchase the game. The franchise markets itself as an action thrill ride, where the stories are simplistic and presented with already established characters to appeal to the widest audience possible. Here, binary storytelling thrives for mass market audiences, as it allows ideas like protagonist-centered morality to help fuel nostalgic, traditional narrative tropes where good and evil are clearly defined. This binary narrative allows the games to develop clear moral leanings for the audience to root, simplifying the narrative. Even when attempting to portray different shades of grey into its storytelling, there is always a clear moral tilt for the audience to easily make judgments about who is considered good and who is considered bad, as discussed before with Modern Warfare 2019. Enabling these stories to have a clear moral binary to drive the narrative forward and be mass marketable for audiences. This form of mass market narrativization is done due to economic concerns rather than an ideological commitment to sway audiences. Call of Duty narratives are designed this way not out of propagating a militaristic ideology, but rather as mere tools to open up gameplay options to enhance the player experience, adding variety to its already diverse array of mechanics, levels, and concepts for the next action set piece. One example is in Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. The first Modern Warfare 2, where a Russian invasion of the US results in Captain Price detonating a nuclear weapon in the atmosphere to produce a massive electromagnetic pulse that allows the US to gain the upper hand. This outlandish scenario is not done with the aim of authenticity or ideology in mind, but to give the player more gameplay variety of having a level without any electronic gadgets that they've been accustomed to in-game. Ultimately, the developers create a moment with the intention of player feeling, creating a dramatic and cool set piece in space to impact further gameplay levels when fighting the next set of bad guys. Furthermore, the series utilizes corporate trends to adapt to consumer demands, as the creative decisions of Call of Duty games hinge on player feedback to maintain retention. The recent purchase of Activision by Microsoft has resulted in developing a committee to oversee key decisions on the Call of Duty brand. This committee determines features and systems that are developed with player retention and brand loyalty in mind. Developers are discouraged from innovating on certain features to focus on others, allowing consumers to maintain loyalty to the Call of Duty identity. The concept of mass market corporatization has now become a staple of the franchise, as the series seeks to maintain its dominance in the FPS shooter space through player expectations on maintaining the core identity of Call of Duty, which is not just expected, but encouraged by the fanbase. This idea of stimulating the audience to maintain loyalty to the brand is commented by Tim Lenoir and Luke Cadwell, who write, "Popular war game narratives are designed to stimulate affect more than cognition. More often than not, campaign narratives make little logical sense, instead filling in their gaps with eye candy and spectacle rather than making explicit arguments. These franchises rely on carefully crafted incentive structures, epically immersive environments, and over-the-top scenarios to produce adrenaline, euphoria, and other positive effects to secure brand loyalty. As a result, Call of Duty's depiction of war is not enacted out of an ideological commitment to portraying the military in a positive light. its depiction of war is done to fulfill audience expectations on their own preconceived identity of Call of Duty, and thus the military. That is, an action thrill ride that focuses on spectacle with little thought about what they're doing before they pull the damn trigger. If the series deviates away from this tradition, the fanbase will not buy the latest Call of Duty game, forcing Activision to fulfill consumer demand to fulfill profit quotas for shareholders. Activision president Rob Kostic goes as far as to comment, "By the way, our fans very strongly define what Call of Duty is and isn't." This cost of living up to fan expectations and shareholders occurs at the expense of developer freedom and creativity to make the games that they want to make. It also limits developer expression through tight deadlines and crunch to quickly produce games that please shareholders and criticism from fans on the latest Call of Duty game. Infinite Warfare is somewhat of an exception to this, which explains why its narrative ambitions are far different than any other Call of Duty in the series. The developers moved to a 3-year development cycle in 2014 after the ridicule of Call of Duty Ghosts allowed Infinity Ward to experiment with different settings, expand on world-building opportunities, create a much more in-depth character-driven narrative, and deviate away from the traditional Call of Duty identity. This allowed Infinity Ward to have more creative freedom than what other modern Call of Duty games are nominally allowed. Although they were still tied to the Call of Duty brand, it allowed the narrative to become more cohesive and logical, allowing for genuine plot and character development in between levels rather than each mission being crafted to excuse the next action set piece. Its campaign and its setting being chosen not to please fans, but to allow for more creative expression, and tell a story that the developers wanted to make with passion. Infinite Warfare's announcement, met by mockery from the gaming world and its lackluster sales at launch, resulted in Activision and Infinity Ward abandoning its creative endeavors to make a new sub-series in favor of rebounding commercially with the Modern Warfare reboot. Games that are typically artistically risky often do not succeed commercially, and can usually only succeed financially through positive word of mouth, engaging gameplay, and good marketing. For example, Spec Ops: The Line, one of the most important anti-war works that satirizes Call of Duty's extreme power fantasy, was a commercial failure as a result of its deceiving marketing as a generic third-person military shooter and its generic and substandard gameplay. However, this formulaic gameplay allowed it to further the parody of the military genre it masterfully critiques, highlighting the absurdity of the escapist fantasy that Call of Duty constantly preserves. The writers themselves were fully aware of Call of Duty's commitment to this power fantasy, creating a game whose meta-narrative brilliantly highlights the psychological and mental effects on the obsession of being a hero. Walt Williams, one of the lead writers for Spec Ops: The Line, wrote a review of Luke and Tim's work that perfectly encapsulates the ideas of the author's work. While the term military entertainment complex conjures images of dystopian collusion, what Lenoir and Cadwell uncover is far more disturbing. Collusion is unnecessary. By avoiding authenticity in favor of adrenaline, billion-dollar video game franchises, such as Call of Duty and Medal of Honor, do more to create a cultural acceptance of war than military PR could ever hope to achieve. Games have not been co-opted by the military, but rather the opposite. Civilians have transformed war into a consumer product, reducing its emotional renaissance to that of a theme park ride, all in service of reaching a larger audience. Call of Duty is not propaganda because the US military is indirectly involved in the development of these games as a consultant. Although it has contributed to these depictions of war, it is not the sole reason. They are propaganda because we as gamers, audiences, and artists have turned warfare into a theme park ride with little ideological commitment or criticism to war. This inherently sways the Call of Duty games to become ideologically reactionary, exemplifying the very worst tropes of the franchise and the military shooter genre as a whole. As a result, audiences and civilians have commodified war as a profitable endeavor for the video game industry. Likewise, the industry engages in these narratives for building and maintaining as large of an audience as possible for profit. Otherwise, these games would not be able to produce the revenue needed to keep shareholders satisfied, which often occurs at the expense of the artists who make these games. There was a time when I believed that Call of Duty, despite its deeply problematic depiction of the military, had the potential to say something about war. Although I was a young teenager and deeply naive when I played these games, I genuinely believed that Call of Duty, with its interactivity and high production values, had the capacity to say something against war. The problem is that it chose not to. Infinite Warfare proved that going against the Call of Duty formula in its storytelling was possible. Producing a message in its story, while not flawless, enabled a criticism of war that other Call of Duty games in the series have been unable to capture. Had Infinite Warfare been given a sequel to improve the issues of Infinity War's attempt to reach for the stars, it may have given the developers the opportunity to shoot above the moon. Alas, because of the economics of the series and its abysmal initial reception, this opportunity will never arise. There may never be another Call of Duty game that rivals the nuance of Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare or Infinite Warfare. While these games were not perfect by any stretch, Call of Duty 4's impact, especially its campaign and multiplayer, was so monumental it changed the entire video game industry. While Infinite Warfare inspired to live up to its legacy, it produced one of the series' most complex narratives that challenged to a degree what a Call of Duty campaign should entail, with its thought-provoking themes, its criticism of propaganda, fascism, and questions about the nature of death and the extent of sacrifice during wartime. As the series focuses more on maintaining the Warzone Battle Royale mode and aggressively pumping free-to-play elements into its premium releases, the franchise's single-player and co-op narratives have only gotten worse, exemplifying the very issues that have plagued the series for decades and creating even more problems that have had tumultuous effects and consequences for the series' narratives and its developers. Modern Warfare 3's campaign, the second Modern Warfare 3, being a prime example of this, as levels were directly pulled from the Warzone map with a rushed and highly incoherent narrative and blatantly offensive shock value with simplistic messages of terrorism is bad. Call of Duty Black Ops 7's campaign isn't much different, with a co-op campaign pulling missions straight from the Warzone map and using generative artificial intelligence for in-game assets, to the point of even getting congressional attention from such usage. With the series lacking innovation and constantly pursuing nostalgia over new ideas, and mistaking no Russian shock value for thematic insight, the franchise has only doubled down on the problematic tropes and protagonist-centered morality since the Modern Warfare reboot trilogy, enticing the fantasy world that it has made to seduce people into its endless multiplayer mode. Through Call of Duty's refusal to critically examine the themes that enable a proper dissection of war, such as heroism, jingoism, propaganda, and the psychological effects of war, instead indulging or outright glorifying these concepts, as a result of this, Call of Duty cannot be anti-war. Holy sh**, why did it take me so long to just state the obvious? Like, oh my god. Anyway. If this series is to ever critically examine war from a nuanced perspective, it would need a narrative revolution in order to accomplish this. Unfortunately, Call of Duty's inability to deviate away from protagonist-centered morality and its cultural and economic impact prevent the series from being able to diverge away from this identity. Because of how ingrained the series' problematic tropes have become, and how they've only been more exuberated since the Modern Warfare reboot, it is nigh on impossible for the series to deviate away from this path that it has chosen. As a result of all of these factors, Call of Duty cannot be anti-war. Except the one time, or the one few times, it almost was.